So this morning we're talking about John chapter 6. We've already done the intro to John 6, and now we are up to the section where Jesus has just fed the 5,000 and he stays behind. He's sent the people off in the boat, the disciples off in the boat after they've collected all the pieces left over. They wanted to make him king. He won't let them. And it's nightfall and they head down to the sea, get in their boat, push off towards Capernaum. Darkness had already fallen. Jesus had not yet joined them. By now a strong wind was blowing and the sea grew rough. When they'd rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and approaching the boat. They were terrified, but he called out, "It is I, do not be afraid." I imagine they were still terrified. Then they were ready to take him aboard, and immediately the boat reached the land they were making for. So we've talked about this before, that these kind of stories don't just appear randomly, that they're there for a sort of a reason in the flow of the argument that John is making. That is it from John chapter 21, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God.
Yeah, chapter 20, 20 verse 30.
30, yeah. Yeah, we couldn't collect, if we collected all the things Jesus did, it would fill up all the books that we have.
Oh, no, that bit is in 21. Yeah.
These have been written that you might know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Let's clarify, is it in 21 or 20?
It's in chapter 20 that it says, there were indeed many other signs that Jesus performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Those here written have been recorded in order that you may hold the faith that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through this faith you may possess eternal life by his name. And then
that's chapter 20, verse 30, was it?
30, 31, yeah.
Yep.
And then at the end of chapter 21, somebody else must have put this conclusion in. In verse 24, it says, "It's this same disciple who attests what has been written. It is in fact he who wrote it, and we know that his testimony is true. There is much else that Jesus did. If it were all to be recorded in detail, I suppose the whole world would not hold the books that would be written." Okay. Yeah, that's probably true of every single human life. If you tried to give a full explanation, it would be just impossible.
Yeah. So as far as this little passage goes, they try to make him king. He's fed the 5,000. He heads off. The disciples go off. They row 3 or 4 miles across the lake. Does it say they're in a headwind or anything?
Yeah, it does.
Yes.
It says in verse 18, by now a strong wind was blowing and the sea grew rough.
Jesus approaches the boat. They're terrified. He says, "It is I, do not be afraid." So what do we make of that section?
Right. Obviously, it takes a little bit of speculation, guessing, I suppose, to fill in sort of the background. But it seems to me, trying to get an overall picture of it, that the people who had been fed they realized that a miracle had taken place, a pretty amazing miracle, actually. And obviously it reminded them of back in the wilderness times in Israel's past, where food had appeared miraculously from heaven. And this obviously was a signal that God was with them again, reminding them that Israel was God's chosen people. So from that kind of growing realization, there must have been a lot of talk amongst themselves. 5,000 men is a pretty dangerous group, actually. And if they get an idea, it becomes a pretty powerful mob. And I think in my mind, just as I see it happening, Jesus sent the disciples away so they weren't caught up in this sort of messianic hope that Israel was going to rise up and defeat the rest of the world and become leading nation again in the power of God, that they were susceptible to this urge that was growing in the mob.
Yeah.
So he sent them away, and he probably told them to not head straight over, but to go along the coast further, and that he would join them after he had sent the crowd away.
Yep.
And he sent the crowd away by saying, I'm going up into the hills to pray by myself. Go away, come back again another day, that sort of thing. Yep. And so he went up into the hills, but he stayed there praying, and the disciples waited at the rendezvous and then gave up and headed across the lake. And the lake is about 8 miles wide. Every year there's a group in Israel that swims across the lake as a kind of, I don't know, it's got spiritual sort of, it's a spiritual event for them, but yeah, maybe 30 or 40. So it's manageable. Probably made it a lot harder when the storm came up. The wind was blowing against them.
Yeah.
But, it's about 8 miles across, and they'd rode 4 or 5 miles, it says in the New English Bible. So they were just over halfway across, and yeah, finding it pretty rough going. But it means that Jesus walked or came to them across the lake that 4 or 5 miles. It wasn't just yeah, I mean, my imagination gets lost somewhere about there, because if the sea was rough, how do you walk on a rough sea?
Yeah.
Anyway, what I think...
So it probably wasn't a sandbar that he was walking on. 4 or 5 miles.
Well, there's no sandbar goes that far out into the sea.
No.
William Barclay was really trying hard to give it a natural explanation, but there is none. Just like in feeding the 5,000.
Yeah.
The act of generosity of the little boy didn't cause them all to draw out their secret lunches that they'd hidden from everybody else because they were not wanting to share. Yeah. That's another one of William Barclay's efforts to try and explain away the miraculous. But the whole point of this chapter, John put it there with these two incidents to show the extraordinary power of Jesus, that he was making these extraordinary claims, but they were backed up. And they were backed up in this first miracle of feeding the 5,000. It was, he wasn't limited by, just 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but he could provide physically for humankind in an emergency by multiplying physical food and providing enough to feed 5,000 men and their women and children, which is amazing, it's staggering. But then the second miracle that John tucks there, and remember, John was he was in the boat rowing, and I think what I get anyway is that the picture that here are not the mob, but here's his own disciples, and they're maybe not quite in danger, but they were in trouble. They were stuck in the middle of the night, rowing like crazy against the wind, and probably getting discouraged and not sure that they'd done the right thing. Maybe they should have waited longer at the rendezvous for Jesus to turn up, and all the turmoil of what must have been in their minds of having seen the miracle of feeding the 5,000, and then wondering why Jesus didn't fulfill that messianic hope that they had deep in their hearts. Yeah. You see a bunch of men who had begun to follow Jesus who would have been pretty dispirited
Yeah.
And this shows Jesus coming along unexpectedly in the middle of their troubles and joining them and giving them what was the next thing that they needed. So I think the two go together. One is a kind of a demonstration at large to the power of Jesus, a revelation of the evidence that backed up his claims,
Yeah.
and then more personally to the disciples who had left all to follow him and were there in the boat in trouble. And he's showing to them too that he can miraculously meet their needs, bring I know courage, and they didn't understand what he was up to by a long way, but at least it showed that he was who he said he was. It was a revelation to them that all that he'd been saying, even though they couldn't understand how it actually panned out in practice, it was true.
A couple of things that I noted with it was the first, that he's willing to let them head off on their own, and obviously willing to let them possibly even argue and disagree with one another about, Jesus is not here, should we go, shouldn't we go? Then they decide to go and it's windy. He's willing to let them go through that sort of struggle, and that kind of wondering, I suppose that question again, is God good? Can we trust this Jesus who we're starting to discover? Can we actually trust him? Has he got our best interests at heart? And there Jesus steps into that. And the other thing I was thinking about was that if we sort of equate this with the manna from heaven, that the people saw this as a great miracle, just like that back in the Exodus times. The clear response to that was also unbelief, though. And we're about to head into a section where there's a lot of people who won't believe Jesus, even though he's done this amazing thing. And similar to what we see happen in the Exodus, when there was unbelief that followed followed God's amazing provision. Not for all the people.
Yeah. Well, I think that really sums up this chapter. It shows in the overall sort of scheme of the book that John had in his mind, he's spoken to different representative kind of people in Israel, from Nicodemus from the wealthy side, and then officials that he performed miracles for and so on, and then this unnamed cripple that he healed in Jerusalem. He'd been revealing himself in acts to different people in Israel, but calling them all to trust him, to believe that he really was God's gift from heaven for their spiritual salvation. And I think this chapter shows the struggle between belief and unbelief. And it really goes deep, because even his own disciples, it was the first division amongst them, where some of them left because they couldn't really accept the things that Jesus was saying. And then on the other hand, in face of the miracles that he did and the logic of his teaching, like pointing out that God gives signs, and that the manna in the desert that they ate, that their ancestors ate, that was a sign of God's goodness providing for them, his power to give them what they needed to sustain their lives. In spite of all those signs that they saw right there and then, the Jews continued to misunderstand and to take offense at the things Jesus was saying. So it's belief and unbelief growing side by side, challenging right down to the very core of Jesus' whole ministry, of the people who are following him, that more and more they had to affirm their belief and stand strong even against their own puzzling over what God was doing. But
Yeah.
to trust him, just simply to trust him.
Yeah. So to finish off this section of the boat and Jesus walking on the water, the disciples, his close disciples who are in the boat, their reaction is probably quite natural to assume that it's something like a ghost. I think in one of the other Gospels, they think that Jesus is a ghost. And they're terrified. So obviously not just a bit scared, but actually frightened, like probably frightened to the point where they think they might die, which is a natural response to that. It's interesting. Jesus wants them to go through that experience of seeing him provide the miracle and all of the excitement of that, and then the frustration that follows of being in the boat, and then the absolute terror of somehow encountering Jesus. I know is it in Mark or Luke? No, Luke, I think, where their response is they say, "Who is this man? And even the wind and the waves obey him." That's when it comes to storm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so different sort of story, another boat story. But just how those fit together, like that amazement with Jesus, then possibly frustration, and then being terrified. How do you, what's going on there, do you think? Is that something, part of what they needed to go through to really grapple with who Jesus was?
I think so. As you were talking, I just remembered you're a sailor.
Yeah.
And what would you think if you're in the middle of the night on a windy, stormy, you're thinking about the boat sinking and goodness knows what else, and all of a sudden somebody comes walking, like they would have seen him a long way off,
Yeah.
coming in kind of over the water. In one of the boats, does it say that it was as though he was going to work by? Is that on the road to Emmaus? I've forgotten now. But what they had to come to grips with, we take it for granted. Like for us, we accept that God became a human being. The
Yeah.
Word became flesh. He came to dwell amongst us. And in the preface, John says, and we saw his glory, such glory as befits the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. We've accepted that. We've accepted that God became a human being. But can you imagine, like, even sitting in a boat with God as a human being amongst us? Like, seeing a ghost is nothing compared to having God sitting beside you in a boat. If they'd come to fully realize who Jesus really was, and they hadn't by that stage,
Yeah.
that would have been scarier than seeing somebody walking across water to them.
Yeah. I suppose part of it is that it's part of that re-education of their expectations. So like any good Jewish person, it would have been drilled into them that the Lord your God is one. There is no other God than him. And this idea that God could somehow be one but have Father, Son, and Spirit in unity would have been totally foreign to them. And is part of that process of re-educating them, helping them to grapple with that.
Yeah.
Because of what had been drilled into them as good Jewish men.
Yeah. I found myself praying this morning, and I sometimes pray through passages of scripture, and I prayed through the prologue this morning, responding to what was written by John. And at the end there, I found myself saying, was it, from his riches we've all drawn grace upon grace, for while the Lord was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but, and this is where in my kind of praying, I remembered, I think it's Westcott who reconstructs that place where the original text has so many variations that it's obvious they had that the people who transcribed it and sent it, so it made the copies that came down to us, had trouble in grasping what it really means there, where it says, no one has ever seen God but the only begotten Son, he who is closest to the Father's heart, he has made him known. The reconstruction of the text by Westcott is that it's not the only begotten Son, but the only begotten God. That seems to have the best evidence. And in somehow that rang with me. It just seemed to be a natural way of saying what is true, that God actually became a human being, the only begotten God. The only place where God actually became a human being, born of a woman and becoming one of us, you know? Yeah, so, yeah. And I think John is, like he himself obviously became convinced, but it didn't happen all at once. It came over time as they saw more and more of Jesus, listened to what he said and thought about what he said, what he meant by it.
Yeah.
John is actually very conscious that there's a struggle goes on within us to actually put our head around what God has actually done in revealing himself by actually becoming one of us.
I love that idea because it suggests that there's a struggle and, the thinking over time for the disciples, grappling with who Jesus really is, and even developing a theology out of that. Because by the time you read 1 John, so John's first letter, his first bit there, he's convinced, with the word of life, we touched it, we saw it, we held it in our hands. So convinced that this was the word of life itself, and then inviting others into that fellowship. And there's all of these ideas in that letter which come from the prologue and reflect the whole of his gospel.
Exactly. And I think the collection of things that John remembered and put in his book, he did that deliberately to help us to kind of follow that journey of struggling with belief and unbelief and bringing us to the point where we're going to be so finally and utterly convinced. And it's not just by thinking it through and seeing the logic of it, the strength of the evidence, but it's also a deep inner decision that we have to make, like the disciples did here in this chapter 6 of John. Jesus said, will you also go away? And Peter answered for them, to whom can we go?
Yeah.
You are the one who has the word of life. So it's a mind thing, but it's also a deep heart thing, I think. It rings true. I don't know how to explain it, actually. It rings true in the center where you shine the light of reason upon it, but then everything else around, I think it's C.S. Lewis says this, everything else is illuminated by the truth of this claim that Jesus made, so that we understand everything else better. It makes more sense because of a deep commitment that yes, Jesus is who he claims to be.
Yeah. Is there a sense where we've got to go through that journey as well? Someone who really deeply interacts with this gospel and really gets into the story and then sort of lives out the reality of that somehow as they're grappling with the story and living their own life. They could go through these sort of processes themselves of sort of wondering who Jesus really is and thinking through the miracles that he does and the questions that come out of that, and then being terrified, being amazed, being humbled, being all these sort of different emotions that we need to go through as we experience the story in our own lived experience, I suppose.
Yeah. And added to that also, like I think with these disciples in chapter 6, it comes to the point where this is too much for us. Maybe just let's give it a miss.
Yeah.
Go back fishing.
Yeah. So there was one bit at the end here, which I said that was the last point I was going to make about this story, but the bit that we probably should make comment on is that immediately the boat reached the land they were making for, and trying to understand that bit of description that John's put in there. He's used the word immediately. Are we to assume that some sort of space-time travel was possible because Jesus is present? Or how do we grapple with that?
Yeah, I find that a little bit embarrassing, actually. If it is exactly as John seems to say, immediately they were at the other side, then it's part of the miracle. Like, it isn't just the miracle of walking on water, where Jesus showed that he had power over gravity, but
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, power over the whole relationship of space and time. And why not? If he was who he was, and if he did what he did, this could easily be added there. I wish John had talked more about it or said it more clearly.
Yeah.
But otherwise, no, he does say immediately. So it must have been, unless this is, they still had maybe 3 miles to go, and
Yep.
they would have had to still be rowing. They couldn't stop rowing in a rough wind like that, or they'd be in trouble.
Yeah.
Maybe there was a conversation went on between the disciples and Jesus as they were rowing, and that took up enough time for them to have rowed the last. No, I'm like Charles, like William Barclay,
Yeah. Yep.
trying to rationalize it and give a natural explanation.
Yeah. I mean, imagine you're probably only going into a headwind maximum 3 miles an hour or even 2 miles an hour. So it's going to take you at least an hour to do that last 3 miles if it's 8 miles across.
Okay. If I was there, I would have been asking questions, but I don't know whether I could ask an hour, 2 hours worth.
And for it to seem like immediately.
Yeah.
You never know. I've had car journeys like that where you've got into a conversation with someone where you're talking about amazing things and
Yeah.
it feels like immediately. Anyway.
Yeah, it does. But the miracles, the 2 or the 3 miracles, if this is another one at the end, or another part of that second miracle, it's a revelation. There are lots and lots of words there as well, but these miracles are revelations in action of who Jesus is and what God is doing. That there's no real barrier. God isn't somewhere a long way off, but he is part of us, able to be a part of our individual stories as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Should we expect to see miracles happen in our world and in our lives as we grapple with this?
Just after I became a Christian, I was a young engineer up in the Snowy Mountains, and I was at the G-High River camp, I think it was called, doing road design up in the mountains up there. And there were a bunch of kids in the married people had their little houses, and then the single staff, they had their dorms. I've forgotten, we probably had about 100 men there involved in the work. And anyway, I'd become a Christian. I was enthusiastic, and here were these kids of the other engineers, and they had no school. There was no church. And I got the idea of having a Sunday school. And I'd never I think once I'd been to Sunday school when I was taken by a cousin somewhere or other. I didn't know what the heck I was doing, but I was telling them stories as I was reading out of the Bible. And there was one bright kid there, about 12 years old, I think he was, 11 or 12.
Mm.
My boss's son, actually. And I told them this story. Actually, it might have been in Matthew, because Matthew says that Peter had the courage to call out to Jesus as he was coming closer.
Yeah.
If it's really you, Lord, let me walk on water too, which he did.
Yeah.
So I made a lot out of that, and talking about God and sharing everything that I already knew. And this kid asked me, and remember the Gihai River ran not very far away from the camp, and he said, if I walked on the water, would I be able to walk across the water too?
Mm.
I'm thinking, good grief, what if these kids go down there and try to walk across the river?
Yeah.
And so I told him, well, if you see Jesus on the other side and he says, come over, then you can walk across the river.
Good call.
Yeah.
I wonder if he ever did.
So I think God can do miraculous things, but he doesn't do them very often.
No. I suppose they are out of the ordinary sort of events like that.
Yeah.
And for some people, like William Barclay, I suppose, the miracles that are in the Gospels are a barrier instead of something that can lead you to the identity of Jesus in a deeper way. Because if it really did happen, that God became flesh and walked among us, then that's the most extraordinary event that's happened in all of human history.
Yeah.
And it seems reasonable that if that event happened, that there would be these sorts of out of the ordinary things that took place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't doubt at all that there are all kinds of miracles that don't get acknowledged because we've got a mindset that says that these sort of things don't happen anymore, or they don't happen ever. And there's a passage it's in Mark chapter 6 where Jesus went back to Nazareth and preached, and it says there that he didn't heal many people and he was surprised at their unbelief. I think further on in this chapter, Jesus makes a big thing about things can happen when there is when there's belief, when there's something changes in the hearts of men and women that acknowledges God and sees the reality of God's presence in his creation.
Yeah.
That when we have that attitude, then miracles are possible. But if we don't have that attitude, then they're not possible. That's something, there's a barrier there.
And miracles are also very clearly not the main event.
Yeah.
That we can get so far caught up in thinking we've got to have all these miracles, because there's plenty of people in these stories who witness these miracles and it doesn't lead them to believe. Exactly. It's the deeper sort of grappling with the truth of who Jesus is. The miracles are a sign to point you towards that, but still many people who would refuse to believe.
Yeah, exactly. It's a choice. It's a choice that every human being has to face. Do we believe what God has revealed, or don't we?
Yeah.
And destiny hangs on that choice.
Very true. And it's our calling to do all that we can to help other people come to terms with that.
Yeah. To at least know that the choice is there. Later on, Jesus talks about the last day. On the last day, he's going to be raising to life those who are believers. And the people really don't believe there's going to be a last day, or if there is to be a last day, it's going to be because of global warming or atomic warfare or some kind of plague, but they don't recognize that there is going to be a final day when God accomplishes all that he wants to accomplish in this stage of God's creation. And his plan is much bigger than this universe even. And how do you get people to believe that?
Well, for most people, they don't even know how to interact with those ideas, because in one sense they think that they understand Jesus and the church, and that in another sense they've written that off, and so they've got all that sorted in their lives. So there's just no space for, and they think that there's all there is the material world as well. So it's like their presuppositions remove any possibility of being able to talk about this sort of stuff. So I think it's only through that, well, I mean, I suppose talking about it, but it seems to me that a powerful way with people these days is through that connection and conversation and friendship, where they start to take you seriously.
Yeah, it's really hard. I just read the news lately that the Chinese government has rewritten the history of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been a kind of a British colony until it was till their lease ran out, and then it was reclaimed by China or put into a special relationship. But the Chinese government has changed the contract that they had with Hong Kong, and a big part of it is changing the curriculum of the education so that the next generation of kids is not going to know the full story of the prosperity and the freedom that came to Hong Kong when the West ran it, when it was part of the British Empire.
Okay.
That's going to be expunged from their history so that the young people coming up will have a loyalty towards China rather than to these ideas of freedom. And I think that happened with us in our Western civilization. Education, universities taken over by liberal-minded people who maybe have looked at this, but they've never looked at it seriously. And it's frustrating.
I see it in school as well. So we can sit there and talk about, in sort of year 8 humanities, we talk about how democracy came to the world through the Greeks. But the Greek idea of democracy never took hold, and it wasn't until the Christians grabbed hold of it, and through the Middle Ages, through understanding the dignity of every human being, through the priesthood of all believers, that's when ideas of democracy were able to take hold. Anyway, that's part of what I've been reading from Rodney Stark.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah,
really worthwhile grabbing.
The Victory of Reason. Anyway, we probably should wrap it up there for today.
Yeah, well, that's been some good thoughts. Thank you.
Yep, excellent. All right, well, thanks, Laurie. I'll see you soon.
See you. Yeah, see you later.